Welcome to Act 3, Scene 1, summary and discussion of Romeo and Juliet. Act 3 is after the intermission, so Shakespeare begins with another bloody fight, just like he did in Act 1, Scene 1, and it's almost mirrored a little bit, except now we're going to see in Acts 3, 4, and 5, we do not have any kind of prologue. So remember, the prologues were written in a sonnet. Sonnets are supposed to be romantic. So if we could foreshadow like why Shakespeare did not put a sonnet here, it's probably because, things are about to get wacky and we have a lot of foreshadowing, as in Romeo and Juliet, bad things are about to happen. There's no romantic, savvy prologue. And so when Act 3, Scene 1 begins, we've got Benvolio and Mercutio walking around in downtown Verona. And we have foreshadowing in lines 1 through 4 when Benvolio says the following: I pray thee, good Mercutio, let's retire. The day is hot and the Capulets abroad. And if we meet, we shall not escape a brawl. For now these days are hot and the mad blood is stirring. And so what does that mean? Well, it means it's hot outside, we're annoyed, our blood's boiling, and if we see the Capulets, we're probably not going to be able to escape a fight from them. And so Mercutio basically says, whatever, like, I don't hide my weapon. Like, if they want to fight and challenge me, I'm going to fight. And so Tybalt walks into the picture, and of course Tybalt's a Capulet. And who is Tybalt looking for? He is looking for Romeo. And so when they ask Benvolio and Mercutio, hey, have you seen Romeo? They're like, no, well, we haven't. Well, then what can we do for you, Tybalt? And so Mercutio is going to poke at Tybalt a little bit, insult him. And, Tybalt is a hothead, so he's probably going to do something about it, but he doesn't. He waits for Romeo. Now, let's kind of go off to the side and think about Romeo for a second. Romeo just got married. So only 4 people know about Romeo and Juliet's marriage. We've got Romeo, Juliet, Nurse, and Friar Lawrence. And so, in a sense, like by marriage, Romeo is related to Juliet's family. So therefore, Romeo is going to be related to Tybalt at this point. And Tybalt doesn't know it. No one knows it except for those 4 individuals. And so Romeo walks into the picture and he's like, oh, hey, Tybalt. And Tybalt's like, you are a villain. And Romeo says, well, I'm no villain. The name Capulet, I cherish it as much as I cherish my own. And ooh, y'all, that makes Tybalt so mad. And so he challenges Romeo to fight. And Romeo says, look, Tybalt, I really just don't want to fight. And then that makes Mercutio mad because he thinks that love has softened Romeo up. And he thinks that, Romeo needs to fight. And so what does Tybalt do as Romeo's best friend? He fights for Romeo. And so Mercutio actually begins this fight with Tybalt, and they go back and forth. And if you look in the text, you'll see in brackets where it says they fight. Well, in films and on stage, this is a really, really long fight scene. But in the book, it just says they fight. So this means like it takes us like what, 0.5 seconds to read this. But I just want you to know that's a really, really long fight scene. And so what happens is Mercutio and Tybalt are fighting. It's a long fight scene. Romeo is chasing after them, and then Romeo steps in front of his best friend Mercutio and puts his hand out, and he's like, Tybalt, stop. And then Tybalt takes his sword and he stabs Mercutio under Romeo's arm. And so what happens? Well, Mercutio gets a really bad wound right here in his side. And so Mercutio is that friend that like never shuts up. So no one is going to take Mercutio seriously after he's been stabbed. And so he says, I'm hurt. A plague on both your houses. You've made worm's meat of me. Worm's meat as in where do worms live? They live in the ground. So that's kind of gross. You've made worm's meat of me. Ugh. But then he says a plague on both your houses, which is really serious because the plague was terrible. It killed people. He's talking about the Black plague. And so, like, now that'd be like saying COVID-19 on all of your houses. Like, this is not okay, Mercutio. Like, you're wishing that upon your best friend and your enemy. And so Benvolio was like, oh, Mercutio, are you hurt? And Mercutio's like, hey, a scratch, a scratch. And then he takes his hand off of his side, and everybody sees that he's been injured terribly. And so he has a pun here. Remember, a pun is like a play on words. He says, ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man. Mercutio says that. What does Mercutio mean by that? A grave man. Well, grave, the play on words there for grave is going to be a sad man, because he's dead. And then grave as in you're buried in a grave. And so we know that the Mercutio, it's not looking good for him. In fact, when every time I've seen this part of the play performed, Mercutio is like standing on a stage of some sort. So in the 1968 film, Mercutio is standing at the top of a flight of stairs, and he says, hey, it's a scratch, a scratch. So it's almost like he's performing even in his death. And then in the 1996 version, which is a really awesome fight scene, he literally gets on a stage and he goes, a scratch, a scratch. So it's like literally he is performing. So who's going to take him seriously? But then they realize that Mercutio is not going to make it. So Benvolio and a group of the guys in the street, they take Mercutio off stage, and then Romeo is left there. And then Benvolio comes back and is like, Romeo, our dear friend Mercutio has been slain. Okay, well, this is problematic because, number one, not only is he like best friends with Romeo, but does anybody remember who Mercutio is related to? No answers? Well, he's related to the prince. And what did the prince tell the Capulets and the Montagues in Act 1, Scene 1? He said, if ever you disturb the quiet of my streets, your lives shall pay the forfeit. So, oh my gosh, not only did the prince say that the Capulets and the Montagues would die if they started to fight again, he also said that, you know, you're going to be like destroyed. And then Mercutio, his own kinsman, has been killed. So there's no telling how the prince is going to react in this sense. And so Romeo gets so mad. It's like when your adrenaline pumps in, like if you're an athlete or you've ever gotten mad and your adrenaline starts pumping, that's Romeo. And he's like, oh, Tybalt, he just killed my best friend. I cannot believe this. And then what does Romeo blame this on? Any guesses? He blames it on Juliet. And so here, this is at line 107. Romeo says, this gentleman, talking about Mercutio, the prince's near ally, my very friend, hath got his mortal hurt in my behalf, my reputation stained with Tybalt's slander. Tybalt, just an hour hath been my cousin. So how long have Romeo and Juliet been married? 1 hour. Anyways, he says, oh, sweet Juliet, my beauty hath made me effeminate, and in my temper softened Valens steel. So what does Romeo say? He says, Juliet, your beauty has made me act unmanly. It has softened me. I am no longer a man. You have made me do crazy things, which love does make you do crazy things, but so does lust, okay? Just think about it. You do crazy things. And so what happens is Romeo, it says, you know what, Tybalt, I'm not having this. And so his adrenaline's pumping. He starts going at Tybalt, and they begin fighting. And so this is a really long fight scene. Again, when it says they fight in the brackets, it means that there's a really long fight scene. In fact, it's a long fight scene in the 1968 film, and it's an even longer fight scene in the 1996 film. But in the 1996 film, it's interesting because, you know, there are not swords in that film. They actually use guns. And so this is what they do for this scene is between Romeo and Tybalt, they have a chase scene in cars. And And then if you do watch it, I want you to pay attention to how Tybalt, towards the end, I'm going to go ahead and spoil it. What happens here is Romeo kills Tybalt, okay? And so when Tybalt dies in the 1996 film, he falls back like this, okay? So, like, remember, we've got, like, what does this look like? We talked about this. Odysseus did this when he was strapped to the mast of the ship when he was passing through the sirens. It's almost like a sacrifice of some sort. He is, like, in a cross figure. But in the 1996 film, there's literally a statue of Jesus behind him that's under construction, and the heart part of that is missing. So, like, what kind of symbolism is that? Like, what does that mean in that film? You'll see a lot of Catholic imagery in that film. And so just pay attention to that when you watch the film. But anyways, moving on. So Romeo kills Tybalt, and Benvolio is like, Romeo, what have you done? And then this is a very important line in Romeo. Romeo says, oh, I am fortune's fool. What have I done? Like, what does it mean when he says I am fortune's fool? It means I am fortune's plaything. So, like, we have a question in Romeo and Juliet about, what is destiny? Like, did Romeo, like, make the right choice here? Or was it destined for him to kill Tybalt? But he says, I am fortune's plaything. And then Benvolio's like, dude, you gotta go, man. And so Romeo takes off. And then who shows up? Prince shows up with his entourage. The Montagues show up. The Capulets show up. And of course, Lady Capulet, Juliet's mom, is so distraught that Tybalt has died. Remember, there's an insinuation there that she and Tybalt may have had a thing, like a relationship, more than just like aunt and nephew. And so Lady Capulet is one of the only females to speak in this scene, which is very important, which means that she probably did have a thing with Tybalt. That's why she's so upset. But the prince is like, what happened here, Benvolio? Remember, like in Act 1, Scene 1, Benvolio got questioned. Well, now he's getting questioned here again. He's like, well, this is what happened. Tybalt wanted to fight, and so Mercutio stepped in for Romeo. Tybalt killed Mercutio, and then Romeo killed Tybalt for killing Mercutio. And so it's just like a cyclical process. But you know what? Tybalt started it all, and Lady Capulet is like, no, Romeo must not live. He has to die. And then so the prince, what does the prince do? He actually bans Romeo from Verona. So this would be like say you live in Bremen, okay, or Haralson County, and this would be like you getting kicked out of Haralson County and your wife or your husband living there, and say you have to go live in like Carroll County. Well, like to us, that wouldn't be a big deal because we have vehicles and cell phones, but back then they didn't have those things. So Romeo is getting kicked out of Verona, and the prince says, if I see him here, that hour will be his last. So Romeo is not going to live if I see him here in Verona. And that's problematic because Juliet lives in Verona. So what's going to happen now? And so that's really how Act 3 is going to play out, is all these terrible moments of miscommunication. What's going to happen? And so the prince ends this scene furiously, and he has every right to do so. And then we pick up in Act 3, Scene 2, when Juliet finds out about Tybalt's death and Romeo's banishment.